Before I get started, I want to give a shout out to all the paying members of my Patreon channel. Your support is necessary, and without you, none of this is possible. And a special shout out to Daddy Dame for the $20 donation.
My man.
And if you'd like to support the channel directly, Cash App and PayPal are available. Just be sure to let me know in the For section if it's okay for me to thank you publicly, or else I'll assume you'll want to remain anonymous.
Here we go.
Layman's Journal, Chapter 252. So Friday, I was watching President Trump speak with the press in the Oval Office. He was concluding a meeting with FIFA World Cup President Gianni Infantino. It was your standard boring press conference, nothing special, when all of a sudden, this happens.
Mr. President, your allies are calling on you to pardon Derek Chauvin. Are you considering pardoning
Oh,
Derek
good
Chauvin?
question.
No, I haven't even heard about it, no.
Mr. President, on peace.
I haven't heard that.
You may recall.
And I thought that was a bizarre question to ask, because who the hell is thinking of Derek Chauvin? Where's this movement to pardon him coming from? So I did some snooping online, and I came across this video on X, which was retweeted by Elon Musk.
If we are issuing pardons, however, there is one person that President Trump should pardon from federal charges forthwith. It would be incredibly controversial, but I think that it's absolutely necessary. That person is Derek Chauvin. President Trump should, in fact, pardon Derek Chauvin. He should pardon him his federal charges. But when it came to BLM, the inciting event for the BLM riots that caused $2 billion in property damage in the United States and set America's race relations on their worst footing in my lifetime, was in fact the railroading of Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. There were no accusations, even at trial, that Derek Chauvin had committed a hate crime against George Floyd or that he targeted George Floyd because of his race. Despite all of that, Derek Chauvin was convicted on federal charges and pled guilty to federal charges. If we're going to talk about delivering pardons, President Trump, I think, should really seriously consider pardoning on federal charges, he can't pardon on state charges, Derek Chauvin, who is convicted of the murder of George Floyd. As I say, we will be covering this pretty extensively in the coming weeks. Right now, you should go to pardonderek.com and sign our petition asking President Trump to grant justice to Officer Derek Chauvin. That is pardon, P-A-R-D-O-N, Derek.com, P-A-R-D-O-N-D-E-R-E-K.com.
So it's all coming from Ben Shapiro. He's the one pushing this garbage, and we're going to talk about it. So let's get it. First, let me say, this video is not, I repeat, not about the George Floyd case. I'm not trying to litigate that whole situation again. What I want to do is focus on Ben Shapiro's call for a presidential pardon and the political ramifications or fallout from it. And to kick things off, I want to play a clip from conservative pundit Rob Smith and the statements he made on the PBD podcast.
I hate this so much, and I'm going to tell you exactly why I hate this. Number one, there is absolutely nothing beneficial that pardoning Chauvin would do for the Trump administration, for this country, for race relations, for anybody else. It is absolutely destructive. It makes no sense. And so for me, when I first saw this, generally conversations that happen come from the ground up. Usually there's some sort of murmuring under, and then it kind of like bubbles up, and then it becomes a national conversation. This seems to be a very top-down conversation that comes from somebody with an enormous amount of influence. This is nothing that anybody was talking about or thinking about. So it really makes me question, why is this conversation happening right now?
Yes, that's exactly right. Who's calling for this? This isn't something the grassroots is asking for. This isn't the reason why people voted for Trump. This is an inorganic move by Ben Shapiro.
Who does this benefit? Doesn't benefit Trump, doesn't benefit America, doesn't benefit race relations, it doesn't benefit anything.
Again, Rob Smith is right. This isn't something that Trump can benefit from politically, so there's no upside to doing this. Continuing.
So what? Trump's agenda is supposed to be derailed? Where we're at as a country right now is supposed to be derailed?
I also agree with that. This isn't part of the Trump agenda, because President Trump is focused on securing the border, stopping the war with Ukraine, using Doge to get rid of government waste, and fixing the economy. Why would he stop doing all of that, doing things that can help all of us in America, for Derek Chauvin? Continuing.
Because these leftists and these Democrats are looking for a reason to have another race war. That is what they love. So why this conversation is happening right now, I have no idea.
So you're not for it at all?
No,
Interesting.
I am not.
Interesting.
And I love that final point. Why give your political enemies reason to rally against you? Why anger and fire up the country? Next, I want to play comments from Stephen A. Smith, as he gave his response to Ben Shapiro's call to pardon Derek Chauvin.
Welcome back to the Stephen A. Smith Show. I want to get into the comments made by conservative commentator Ben Shapiro, who publicly called for President Trump to pardon former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin for the 2020 of Mr. George Floyd. So let me ask you, Ben Shapiro, are you just saying that you just don't want black people voting for you at all? Better yet, are you saying you don't give a damn about black people?
And to add to that point, we're just coming off an election cycle where Trump got record support from black people, specifically black men, who supported him at a rate of 25 to 30%, depending on what poll you trust. So asking Trump to save Derek Chauvin will be a slap in the face to all of the black people that voted for him.
I'll ask you another question, Ben Shapiro. Respectfully, sir, would you have taken that position if George Floyd was a Jewish person? If a black cop had his knee on a white Jewish person for over 9 minutes, Ben Shapiro, would you have called for that individual to be pardoned?
And that's another fantastic point from Smith. Would Ben Shapiro have the same energy if a member of his tribe shared Floyd's fate at the hand of a black cop?
Hell no.
Now that's a rhetorical question because we know the answer is no, because Ben Shapiro is a smug asshole. He's not an honest broker. Of course he wouldn't be calling for that black cop's release. If the victim were like him, Shapiro would get on code and advocate for his people. He'd be calling for that black cop's deletion. Because as much as Ben Shapiro likes to pretend he's a man of principle, he really isn't. He's all about his own self-preservation and the preservation of his people. And the fact that he uses his platform and his company to advocate for his position on Israel at the expense of his fan base is proof of that. And I have no problem with that. I'm the same way personally. I would use whatever resources I had to crash out for my people as well. But I'm honest about it. I wouldn't do that under the false pretenses of an American seeking justice. Continuing.
The Republicans are in a position where all you have to do is live up to what you say. Donald Trump, remember what you said in 2015? What do you have to lose? Remember that? Remember you talked about the black vote and how you would do for other communities? Didn't your numbers increase with blacks? Didn't your numbers increase with the young voters? Think about what you got to do, Republicans. All you got to do, address the economy, address inflation, address the border, address deportation, by the way, because you got to get those folks out that were in here as well. And how you going to do that? Address crimes in the streets of America. Make sure folks got jobs. Make sure folks are safe. Here's a few other things that you got to do. It's not a laundry list. It's just a few. Avoid saying ridiculous nonsense like Ben Shapiro just said.
So in short, Stephen A. is saying, don't muck it up. Biden's presidency was abysmal. People weren't voting for Trump as much as they were voting against Kamala, which would have been a continuation of the Biden presidency.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind. And
See, you could argue politics all day. I've seen you before. You're quite bright. Very, very smart. And your issues are your issues, whatever they may be. And I get that part, but to do something like this...
Exactly. Ben Shapiro is no dummy. He's been in this political game too long not to know the outcome of pardoning someone like Derek Chauvin. He knows the ramifications of this, how it would bury Trump's presidency. More on that later.
If they pardon Derek Chauvin, if they let that man out of jail after George Floyd, you've learned all you need to know. Don't even look at their asses no more.
And that goes without saying. If Trump pardons Chauvin, it will destroy all the progress he's made with black voters. And it will destroy the ambitions of any candidates that come after him. It would take us back to the days when blacks voted 95% in favor of Democrats, meaning the Democrats could run a tomato can in 2028 and still win if Trump pardoned Chauvin. But yeah, Rob Smith and Stephen A. Smith made some great points, and they're just the tip of the iceberg. There are videos all over social media by political commentators dragging Ben Shapiro for pushing this. And the question is why? Why would Ben Shapiro advocate for something so stupid? Which, by the way, wouldn't help. You see, Derek Chauvin is serving 2 concurrent sentences. one for the federal government and one for the state of Minnesota. Trump pardoning him wouldn't get him out of prison because he still has to put in his 20 years for the state. So it would be a symbolic gesture at best. So what would be the point? Why is Ben Shapiro pushing this? I think the answer is easy. Because he hates Donald Trump.
Because as entertaining as Donald Trump is a liar. Trump has the capacity to destroy. I'm not sure he has the full capacity to build. Trump knows way less about policy than my 4-day-old child. And he cares less about the Constitution than my boy does.
Do you think that Trump has any chance of winning?
Yeah, he has a chance because he still has 100% name recognition. You could see some weird circumstance in which the Democrats shoot themselves in the foot so badly that he wins. Do I think that chance is very strong? No. I think that he is the weakest Republican that could be fielded against Joe Biden.
Now, in all fairness, he did vote for Trump in 2020 and 2024, but in 2016, he was never Trump. And he initially supported Ron DeSantis in 2024. So he's flip-flopped on his support of Trump twice. And it was only after he became president and got the nomination that he got behind him. So he's pretending to support Trump because he has to, not because he wants to. Because Ben Shapiro is a neocon, a globalist or statist conservative. He would prefer a presidency like George Bush. And Trump is more of a radical. He's a populist whose support comes from the grassroots. He's the type of Republican that globalists and neocons hate. Because when Trump leaves office, it'll be his surrogates taking over. People like J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, and Pete Hegseth, leaving no room for clowns like Shapiro. But if he sabotages Trump's presidency and legacy, his second term will be a lame duck. He'll be president in name only, and his surrogates will go down with him. And Ben Shapiro knows that. As Stephen A. Smith said, he's not stupid. He knows the country doesn't want this, and he knows it'll end Trump's greater agenda. In other words, Ben Shapiro is a conniving little shit. This is a play to undermine Trump and alienate him from his voter base. So I'm going to let those be my final thoughts. But before I go, please check out my latest video on Patreon. It's an in-depth breakdown of the film Revolutionary Road. Here's a preview. Layman's Journal, Chapter 251. 1950s America is affectionately known as the Happy Days. It was a time of economic prosperity, military dominance, and cultural homogeny. And our neighborhoods, as well as our urban areas, were safe, and our schools were excellent. It was also the apex of American manufacturing, so there was no inflation or stagflation, no outsourcing of jobs, or importation of cheap immigrant labor. So it was easy for a man coming straight out of high school with nothing more than a diploma to find a great paying job. And by the time he was age 23, he would have a house, a car, a stay-at-home wife with 2 children, living comfortably on just one salary. And speaking of families, we had a baby boom, the largest in American history. And it was primarily because work was so readily available for men, so it was easy for them to marry and start families. It's also worth mentioning that we were morally grounded at that time. Church attendance was high. And when I say church, I don't mean the modern church, because this was a time before the prosperity gospel, before we had multi-million-dollar pastors with billion-dollar ministries. They didn't focus on motivational rhetoric or Ghana-centric talking points back then. They were real churches who had a real focus on God and the Word of God. So we didn't have baby mama, baby daddy culture in our communities. Women married before they carried, and most were virgins when they married. And they stayed that way because this was a time before we had no-fault divorce. And again, that's why it was called the Happy Days. And that's the way it was for our parents and grandparents. I say parents because, as I've shared before, I'm an oops baby. My parents married in the 1950s. My dad was 34 and my mom was 18 when they wed.
What?
That's right. My daddy married an 18-year-old virgin.
My man.
But getting back to my point, my siblings are all boomers, and I'm a zennial. So when I was coming up, they were all grown and out of the house. And my parents stayed married until my father's death 60 years later. And again, that's the way they did things back then. Most of my parents' friends were also married until death. I can only think of 2 in particular that were either divorced or raising children alone. My point is, it wasn't common. And as a result, Children grew up well-adjusted. The psychological, behavioral issues we have today weren't present en masse back then. But the kids weren't the only ones that were okay. The adults were good too. People back then were not abusing alcohol or narcotics like they do now, and women were not addicted to antidepressants. And men didn't struggle with pornography addictions. So yeah, those were the happy days. But they weren't perfect. Radical prejudice was at an all-time high in the 1950s. Blacks were treated as second-class citizens, with limited protections under the law. And while America as a whole was doing well, blacks as a whole were not. Now you had enclaves in cities like Detroit and other areas throughout the Rust Belt, where black people were prosperous. But overall, we were locked out of the economy, particularly in the South, where most of us were relegated to sharecropping and other forms of low-wage work. But then the tumultuous 60s and 70s came around, which brought about change, and that had its pluses and minuses as well. On the positive side, it made systemic racism illegal, so blacks across the nation could partake in the American dream. But it also ushered in second-wave feminism, also known as the women's liberation movement. Because of programs like affirmative action, women were able to advance in the workplace, allowing them to become financially independent from men. You also had the welfare system, or the Great Society, that allowed women to raise children as single mothers. And they were given birth control and the right to abort their children, which incentivized a pursuit of their careers, as well as an embrace of promiscuous culture. But more importantly, they were given no-fault divorce and a family court system that ruled heavily in their favor. All of this made marriage an antiquated form of survival for women, because now they no longer needed men to sustain them, which on the surface seems great. Women got their sexual liberty and economic freedom, but it marked the beginning of what we now recognize as the gender war, where women went from being our helpmeets to our rivals. And the results have been devastating. Generations later, the divorce rate has skyrocketed, marriages have plummeted, and birth rates have taken a sharp decline. And of the children that are born, 40% of them are being brought up in unwed homes. And it's led to a push, a return to traditional values, to get back to the happy days of the 1950s, when families were strong and enact. This, of course, ruffles the feathers of the modern feminists, who rail against traditional values. They hate the concept of a nuclear family and see the 50s as a dark age for women, because they'd rather have their sexual independence, careers, antidepressant drugs, lonely nights, and cats than husbands and well-adjusted children. In other words, they're in open rebellion. And to make sure America never returns to the days of stable family structures, they've resorted to revisionist history. And many, like Alice Walker, have created false narratives with stories like The Color Purple to illustrate what life wasn't like for black women in nuclear families.
Nobody. Look at you. You're black, you're poor, you're ugly, you're a woman, you're nothing at all.
Yeah, they created demons like Mr., who treated women like property, causing black women today to believe that feminism and the sisterhood are their only saviors, that traditional values are about enslavement. Which brings us to Revolutionary Road, the subject of today's video. Again, please be sure to check that out. It's some of my best work. And while you're there, be sure to check out the rest of the videos in my Patreon library, as I'm sure there's something there you'll enjoy. And that's it. That's all I have to say about it. What do you have to say about it? Leave a comment in the comment section and let's have a conversation.
How am I spending my Friday? Some jerk chicken with rice seasoned, red beans and some bread. Got some red wine over here. And I'm watching Layman's Journal on YouTube. Shout out to the brother Layman. You know, check him out. I'll leave the link in the description. It's your boy Calvin King. And this is how I'm enjoying my Friday.